Sins into merits. This is a concept that is really unique to Judaism. And I think it's fascinating because some people, because of teachings and perceptions or what have you, um, stereotypes, maybe, there is an idea that Judaism is rigid, that it doesn't involve a lot of grace. It's a faith system that's built on works. So you have to do something in order to earn salvation. It's all merit based or what have you. And of course, that's not true at all. Never has been true. That is actually what we've talked about in previous broadcasts, what they call a straw man argument. It's a phony, baloney, plastic banana, good time, rock and roll argument that's made up in order to make your new religious system valid or seem valid, right? But what's interesting to me, given that stereotype, pardon me, and that is that unique to Judaism is a concept that is really phenomenal, that states that it is possible to turn sins, intentional sins, by the way, into merits, into something beautiful, into something holy, into something righteous. Now, I'm not aware of any religious system, and I'm just not aware of it. Perhaps there is out there some obscure or maybe not so obscure religious system that provides this opportunity. But I'm not aware of it, if it exists, in which somebody could take something that is wrong and through a divine process convert it into something holy. But that's exactly what one is able to do naturally through God in Judaism. And I think that's phenomenal. So today's topic really has to do with unintentional sin and really exploring why we need to make atonement or we need to ask forgiveness for unintentional sin, which I think is a good question overall. But this is what spurred me to think about this concept. Pardon me. But anyway, but going back to the unintentional sin aspect, that's a good question too, because in our Greco-Western mindset, we tend to give people passes or give ourselves passes for unintentionality. Now, I will say that I'm kind of a quasi lawyer, but that's neither here nor there. But this is just kind of the way I think. So I like to approach things analytically and think things through. And anyway, if you've been around here long enough, you probably have figured this out. So I constantly find myself raised eyebrow, questioning certain things that are sometimes held as almost cliches in society. So with that, I what I'm talking about, and by the way, good morning. Glad you're here. Please be sure and subscribe to this video, or I always get it backwards. Why do I do that? I say this every day of my life. I'm sorry. Please sure and like this video and subscribe to the channel. There we go. I always get those things backwards. But anyway, also, listen, time is running out on registering for the Passover event. If you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, it occurred to me that people watch this channel and they don't know where we are. we are in Fort Worth, Texas, specifically in Saginaw, Texas, and which is a suburb of Fort Worth. And so if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex or within a 100-mile radius, now, if you're outside the 100-mile radius, you don't have to attend here. But if you are within 100 miles of Fort Worth, you must attend here. And so it's biblical law. It's not really, I'm kind of made that up just now, but it makes sense to me. So anyway, we want you to be part of it. So please be sure and register. Now, going back to this unintentional sin thing. Western mentality is very often, and I think you may agree with me on this, it's schizophrenic. We on the one hand, we tend to kind of shrug off unintentional sins, particularly if it's moi who committed it, right? oh, I didn't really mean to do that, and therefore we kind of shrug it off as if it's not a big deal. And then on but on the other hand, we are ready to prosecute somebody for involuntary manslaughter, let's say, right? Or we're ready to sue somebody for creating an environment in which an accident ensued. Let's say a slip fall. Somebody mopped a floor, but they unintentionally didn't put out a sign. Let's say that says, piso mojado. And so therefore, when you went to walk across it, you slipped and fell and hurt yourself. And now you want to sue them, right? And that's very common, something to that effect. So and the person says, hey, I didn't mean do it on purpose. That was an unintentional thing. And we say, we don't care. Your unintentional act led to my injury. Therefore, you owe me money. And yet we often, very often have that idea. But then when it comes to religion, we're like, oh, it's unintentional. Who cares? God doesn't even care. But yet we care, right? It's kind of like we have no problem when so we also have this mixed idea, which I think is very detrimental to our culture, and I want us to stop it. And that is where we treat adults like children. Meaning that, so in America, in Los Estados Unidos, generally speaking, you become an adult at 18 years old. Now, some states are 17, such as Texas, and I think maybe Florida, but it doesn't matter. But sometimes it's 17 or 18, but generally speaking, it's 18, right? 18 years old, you're considered an adult. Yeah, I mean, you're your own man, you're your own woman. And so now naturally at 18, we don't have the life experience we do at, say, 40 or even 30. Uh, but so what? You're still an adult, right? You're still held now. You're held fully accountable for everything, or you're supposed to be. You can join the United States military and go storm a beach somewhere and die for your country at 18. And yet, a lot of times, we treat people who are 18 and 19 and 20 and so forth as if they're little children who don't know, they don't know anything. And I kind of get it on one hand, right? So when you're vintage like me, and we tend to look at 18-year-old people and we say, you're just a kid. And I totally understand that aspect, because when you're a little bit older, we tend to look at people who are quite a bit younger and just say, you don't have the life experience to understand how stupid you really are. And I totally get that. And on a cultural level, we can look at people and kind of have that mentality, although it's not always true. How many of you know there are plenty of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and even 50 and 60-year-olds who are wholly immature and, don't, what I mean? They still haven't learned from their life experience, right? That's true. So it's hard to paint with a broad brush, but generally speaking, we have a tendency in our culture to act as if you're 18 or 19 or 20, that you're just a child, and we need to stop that, because A, it's not true, and B, if you treat people like that, then they will be that. In Judaism, you become a man at 13. Now, granted, no one in their right mind really thinks that at 13 you're fully capable of being an adult, clearly. However, it is an important rite of passage. And what it communicates to the young man, of course, young ladies become women at 12, okay? Granted, no one's going to marry off their daughter at 12, and no one's going to consider her a full-grown woman. Clearly, no rational person is going to do that, nor should they. However, it does communicate to these young people, these now young adults, that, hey, you're in another class. You're no longer a child at this point, okay? You're not exactly a full-grown adult, and no, we're not going to, drop you off at a street corner and say, good luck to you, sweetheart. Hope life works out well for you. We're not going to do that, because we're not insane. However, we are going to now communicate to you that you have a level of responsibility and you need to now grow that maturity level. Okay. And now when you go from 13 to 18, you are expected to, kind of spread your wings and get out there. Now, it's just like with our daughter Hadassah. She still has a huge support base in mom and dad. We are here to support her. We are here to help her. We are here to, if she needs help, if she wants to call and ask for advice and what counseling or whatever to make a decision, we are here. And yet she is an adult and she is not a child. And so the reason I'm on this soapbox is because for two reasons. Number one, it relates back to us spiritually, that we have to stop pretending that it's not our fault. Even unintentional sins, as we're about to find out, as I'm getting ready to dive into the insights here, it is our fault, even when it's unintentional. Okay, that's number one. Number two, it is not healthy as a society for us to have this schizophrenic idea that if you're 18 and 19 and 20, that you're just a child and you don't know what you're doing. We are very schizophrenic about that, because let's say that you were a clerk at a 7-Eleven and an 18-year-old person, or 19, comes into the 7-Eleven and robs you at gunpoint. Are you inclined to go, police officer, listen, yeah, how old were they? 19? Oh, 19. Golly, when I was 19, I did a bunch of stupid stuff. I was such a moron at 19. Just forget it, really. I mean, they're just children. They really probably they're playing cowboys and Indians. That may not be politically correct. I'm sorry. Cops and robbers. There you go. And they probably didn't know what they were doing, and they just kind of got carried away, and they robbed my store and put a gun on my face and almost killed me. But they're children, so don't even worry about it. In fact, I'm not even sure why I called you. If I'd known they were 19, I wouldn't have called you. So wink, wink, nod, nod, forget it. Would you do that? Of course not. We would throw them in the slammer for 40 years. We'd want them to go to prison for the rest of their life, most likely, if you were the one with a gun in your face. If you're not the one with a gun in your face, you probably want to be on probation. But if you're the one who almost died, you probably want them to go to prison for the rest of their life. We don't care that they're 19. That's what I'm trying to talk about, guys. We have to be not schizophrenic. Okay. We have to not be schizophrenic with that situation. We need to not be schizophrenic in our own situation. Am I making sense? So this is about taking responsibility. Now, the third thing here, though, is that, again, going back to this idea of Judaism, Judaism has this opportunity that is unique to it, in which we can take we can take intentional sin, which is a whole nother level, and we can turn it into an unintentional sin. Incidentally, in legal terms, this would be equivalent to, let's say, capital murder, and maybe turning it into involuntary manslaughter or something like that. That's a really extreme example. But in the case of Judaism, it goes even further. Because what Judaism says is that God said through proper teshuvah, and this is the key, through sincere teshuvah, I should say, one can take their intentional sin, which essentially intentional sin is a rebellion against God, and that's what you and I have to understand. This is the sad commentary of sin, and that is that when we sin, and it doesn't matter what it is, ladies and gentlemen. And I know we all like to categorize sin, and that's all part of our self-preservation justification, built-in justification program. Well, I know that I ate a pork chop, but I haven't murdered anybody, as if, and granted, on the scale of divine justice, is there a difference between eating a pork chop and murdering somebody? Sure. But in the grand scheme of things, sin is sin. Okay. And we like to compare ourselves. Well, I know I've spoken Lashon Hara till the cows came home, but I never did that. And so we like to justify ourselves. But the reality is that no matter what sin we've committed, whether we're eating a pork chop or killing somebody, at the end of the day, we are rebelling against God. And that's what you and I need to understand, that When it's intentional, it's rebellion. And so it behooves us, it behooves you and I to understand that when we are committing a sin, we are now beginning to rebel against God. And when we appreciate that reality, then it becomes more poignant to us, and teshuva becomes more apparent. Now, I want to before I'm gonna get into this concept of unintentional sin, and we're gonna find out what the root of it is and why it's bad. Because once again, I'm kind of on three different topics here. One is dealing with our maturity and accepting it. I by the way, it bothers me to no end. You probably figured this out already. When people are like, "Oh, they're only 18, they're only 19, they're only 20 or whatever. They're just children." You know where a lot of young people are at 18 and 19? A lot of men and women, by the way. Um, they're in places like, well, not anymore because I think some of these wars have ended finally, but they were in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, fighting in the Imperial Japanese, fighting the Nazis at 18 and 19. I met a young man one time and he looked so young. He looked like he was 12. This has been a number of years ago. He was a graduate from college and was an officer in the army. So that means he had to be what, 22, 23, maybe 24. He looked like he was about 12. And I don't mean that as a slight against him. He just happened to be one of those gentlemen that looked very young. I met him one day and he told me he was in the army. This has been a long time ago. And I said, "Oh, that's really great. What do you do in the army?" And I'm thinking, I don't know what I was expecting. But he said, "I fly Apache helicopters." I'm sorry, what? Does your mom know you do that? I mean, I was like, what? And so, guys, I mean, here's a person in their early 20s flying attack helicopters. So please stop with the I'm 18 and 19, I'm just a child. Please stop. Okay. That drives me bananas. And it's not healthy for our society. It's not healthy at all. And so we're dealing with that. But let me bring in a psychiatrist, okay, to help us through this. So this is Rabbi Twersky, who is a rabbi and a psychiatrist, and this is what he says on this topic, and it's so good. This is actually from an insight. This is Living Each Day from the Insight to Adar 24. It says, "It is perfectly reasonable to ask forgiveness for behavior that resulted from immaturity, provided that we behave more responsibly rather, as mature grown-ups." Okay. However, if we persist in behaving in a juvenile manner when we have the capacity to do otherwise, we can hardly put forth an immaturity as a defense. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, when we are adults, right, we can't really put forth the immaturity as, "I'm sorry, I was just being immature." Well, okay, but you have the capacity for maturity. You see what I'm saying? It's like saying you can't put forth the insanity plea when you're not insane. That's kind of what's going on here. Now, looking at an insight, there's a whole lot of wonderful things that can be said. There's if you happen to have Rabbi Monk's commentary, "The Call of the Torah," which is more or less our text for the Aliyah day. I do use other sources, but this is kind of my baseline source as far as a textbook for the Aliyah. Then, if you happen to have the volume on Vayikra, you can look at his commentary on chapter 4, which begins on page 26. It's really good, but I'm going to hit some highlights here as to the understanding of unintentionality and what's the root of it and why, therefore, we have to make teshuva for it. And so this is what he says. One of the things is the obligation to bring a hatat offering for a wrong committed unintentionally is characteristic of the uniqueness of the Torah's system of sacrifices. Whatever the nature of the sin, declares Rambam, it brings a stain on the soul, and that stain must be removed before the soul can appear before Hashem. And this is really an important concept because sin is sin. And as I said earlier, we like to justify our sin. We like to make excuses. Well, blah blah. And we like to shrug it off as if it's not that big of a deal. But see, That's usually because we are comparing ourselves with somebody else. And that is not the appropriate standard. Hear me on this. And this is very important because a lot of people wonder, why do I need to make teshuvah every day? And I kind of get it because Judaism is really big on this. And a lot of people misunderstand that and think that you're making teshuvah for something in the past, which usually is not true. Although there is a concept of making teshuvah on our teshuvah, meaning that we can improve the teshuvah we've already made for some other area, right? Particularly if it's something that we tend to struggle with, because all of us have various things that with which we tend to struggle, and your struggle is different than my struggle usually. You may struggle with something that I have no problem with, and whereas I struggle with something that you have no problem with, and vice versa. Okay, but Judaism understands another reality, that is that every day we need to make teshuvah because there's something probably for which we need to make teshuvah, right? I mean, okay, don't raise your hand, okay, so that no one else sees you. But would you agree with me that most likely there's something that happened yesterday? It could be a little something, but remember, little somethings can become big somethings. There was something that happened yesterday for which you need to make teshuvah, or maybe something you didn't happen yesterday, a sin of omission, as opposed to a sin of commission that occurred yesterday that you probably need to make teshuvah for. I'm gonna say, yeah. I mean, there's something that I could have, should have, would have done better yesterday, or something I could have, should have, would have done that I didn't do yesterday, that I really need to go back and reflect on that. And listen, there like the one of my favorite lines from from the movie The Patriot is aim small, miss small. And what that means is that if you aim for the bullseye and really for the center of the bullseye, in this case in the movie, he was encouraging his sons to aim for the buttons on the enemy's coat. You may not always hit the bullseye, you may not always hit the button, but you will always hit the man. Okay, in this case, because we're talking about battle. But in terms of a target, you may not always hit the bullseye, which is great if you do, but you will always hit the target. And so, therefore, when we are examining ourselves, a lot of people, when we examine ourselves for sin, we look for the big things. Where's the elephant? Rarely do we nitpick our own lives. We tend to nitpick other people, which is never appropriate, but we rarely nitpick ourselves. Now, let me pause here and say, I'm not talking here about low self esteem or developing a self deprecating attitude. Please do not do that. Don't become that person that is constantly talking down and bad about yourself. I'm so dumb. I'm so ugly. I can never do anything right. Oh my God, I look awful. Oh my God, I'm awful. Oh my God, I'm terrible. How can anybody love me? Don't be that person, because that actually is mental illness. And you really need to see a therapist about that. Okay. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is looking at your life and saying, I really know I can do better there. And here's the deal. When we focus on the small things in our life and we fix those things, I missed Minka yesterday, and I missed it several times this week, and that's really not okay. I need to fix that. That is where we become maturely strong people. Okay, and that's where the aim small, miss small comes into play. Okay, where we begin to focus on our small, so that they don't become big things, so that we don't, in this case, in that example, we don't develop a prayerless life. Okay, so continuing on here, it says here the theme of complete responsibility for sin, which is what we were talking. Isn't that great? Don't you love that? Taking complete responsibility. Gosh, if we would only do that in Western society. Anyway, the theme of complete responsibility for sin, whether committed intentionally or unintentionally, has numerous examples in the Talmud. We are told by Rabbi Akiva, who wept when he realized the serious consequences of sins, whether committed in ignorance of law, by accident or even unconsciously, Rabbi Isi ben Yehuda exclaimed, that is what causes us so many afflictions. Along the same lines, the story of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis illustrates the moral responsibility that the individual bears, even for acts that were committed involuntarily to serve God's will and historic plan. That's huge. Maybe you may not have caught what I just read, but in this, with the scenario that's given here, is that in the case of Joseph's brothers, they betrayed him, sold him into slavery, ostensibly killed him. And that was really all part of God's plan. That ultimately was all part of God's plan to get Joseph to Egypt so that Joseph could become ruler of the world and therefore become a Messiah to his brothers. Just like it was God's plan for the people of Israel, the brethren of Israel, to betray Yeshua, hand him over to the Romans, just like we did Joseph. The purpose of that was so that Yeshua could become king of the world, so that he could save his brothers. Now, even though that's all part of God's plan, that does not absolve the brothers of their guilt, nor does it absolve Jews of our guilt for betraying the Messiah. Just because it's part of God's plan doesn't make it okay. The bottom line here is we have to take responsibility for our actions, whether it was intentional or unintentional. In the scenario I gave of the piso mojado, we forgot to put out the wet floor sign. And as a result, somebody fell and hurt themselves. That is our fault. And we have to make restitution. You can't say, well, it's not my fault. I forgot. By size, I'm only 19. Right? I mean, we're right. Like, and I'm sorry, how does that matter? It's so right. And so certain areas it matters. And so that's what I'm talking about. Don't be schizophrenic. So we have to say, okay, I take responsibility for that. That's my fault. I should have put out that sign. I didn't, and you fell. And so therefore, I'm responsible now to make restitution. Another insight here. So this next insight gets to the root of the whole problem. This is really, really good. So this is what it says. Talking against unintentional. Now remember that the thumbnail I used was turning sins into merits. Now, the way that this all relates, let me go ahead and say this because so we don't get lost. The way that this all relates. So, okay, Rabbi, you're talking about taking responsibility. You're talking about unintentional sin in the root of it, and you're talking about turning sins into merits. How does this all connect? Well, here's the deal. In order to turn our sins into merits, whether they're unintentional or intentional, the key to that is taking responsibility and being mature enough to make sincere teshuvah. If we don't do that, if we just sit back and say, it really wasn't my fault, I couldn't help it, I was born this way, I'm just really, blah, 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 blame it on you remember that song, Milli Vanilli? Blame it on the rain. How many of you remember Milli Vanilli? Are you that old? Who remembers Milli Vanilli? Come on, be honest. And who, be honest, used to jam to them before they were, lip syncing? Blame it on the rain. So listen, you can't blame it on the rain. You have to take responsibility. And that's how you turn sins into merits. That's really the gold standard here, right? All right. So this is what it says. Here's the root. Many of you remember Milli Vanilli. Okay, here it says, what is that? Why is it that the law regards a sin committed unwittingly as an act requiring atonement for forgiveness? This is the wonderful wonderful insight. It says, our sages explain that such a sin is a sign of negligence or a lack of attention in performance of mitzvot. Oh, this is where it gets down to the nitty gritty. we like to shrug it off and go, well, I did that unintentionally. Yes, we did that unintentionally because we weren't paying attention, because we are being negligent. And that's the intentional part. In order to do something unintentionally, we have to be doing something intentionally negligent. It's kind of like if you're driving down the road and you're just kind of driving fast and furious. You don't mean to knock somebody off the road and cause an accident, but your irresponsible driving led to that accident. Therefore, you are responsible. So even though the accident itself was unintentional, what was intentional on your part was the irresponsible and reckless driving. You see? And that's why unintentional sin requires atonement. So it continues here and says, experience shows that when a person considers something to be of great importance, it never escapes his watchful eye through carelessness or forgetfulness. So this is the other thing that kind of hurts. And that is that when something matters to us, we're not negligent with it. Ugh. Ugh. Now, there's 1,000 examples for this, but we know it to be true. When something really matters to us, it's kind of like the mama. I love analogies, by the way. As you can tell, it's like the mama and her baby, right? What does a woman, and I'm not limited to women because men care too, but generally women are a little bit more over the top. Not over the top. I don't mean like negatively, but you know what I mean. But a woman and her baby. I mean, is there really anything other than that aside? Well, I mean, a man and his firearm, but that's not quite the same, although very close. But a woman and her baby, is there anything that really she is focused on that child? The child could make a peep, and the mama already knows that the child can go, wah, and the mother has interpreted that as a paragraph. I mean, that's really, but when we don't really care, then we're being negative, and that's where unintentionality comes. So it says here, the more he sincerely cares about a sacred duty, the more he takes care to ensure that it's carried out consciously and without delay. A person's higher interests in life are not marked by carelessness and error. Yikes. Oof. So, taking the above argument a step further, King Solomon declared, a sin committed even unknowingly is not good for the soul. Proverbs 19:2. The point is elaborated by the sages in the Midrash Tanchuma, who comment, a sin committed in error should not in itself be the sinner's main cause of sorrow. Okay? So, oh man, I did that by mistake. That shouldn't be what makes us sad. What makes us sad should be that the fact remains, if something was done in error or unintentionally, what it means is that the door was left open to sin. Yikes. We've got an open door somewhere. You say, well, man, I didn't really mean to do that. That was unintentional. Well, that's because there's a door open somewhere, and we've got to figure out where that is and close it. That is what the sages of the Midrash tell us. That's what should bother us. What should bother us, and trust me, this hits home for yours truly, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, there's a door somewhere, and why was that door open? And you've got to close it. And this is why it's important to take responsibility. For one thing, going back to my soapbox about the young adults, right? Which I think is the plague, as I said, the plague of our culture is that we treat young adults as children. That's so foolish. For one thing, if we fail to take responsibility, then at what point do we expect life experience to get involved? Right? Something they used to tell us in the military, which I didn't I really didn't, I don't think really fully appreciated until a number of years later, and that was number one, when you made a mistake, right? They told you to do something, you did it wrong, whatever the situation was, we were told, it was impressed upon us that we were never to make excuses. You were just you were supposed to, if you made an excuse, if you said, well, I did this because blah blah, then you were going to get just destroyed. But if you said, basically, I did this and it was a mistake or whatever, then what was said to you, and it was almost like a mantra, what was said to you was, that was good initiative, but it was poor judgment. And that mantra stuck in my head. Fortunately, I wasn't somebody who made a bunch of mistakes. I made a few, and that's we all do. And so, and we were just trained that if you made a mistake, you owned up to it. You basically said, I don't know what happened, but I did that, and that was a mistake. And then your superior would say, all right, that was good initiative, but it was poor judgment. I feel like that really helped me and my other members there to really be able to take responsibility. But you have to start that. And the problem is, if the superior just, well, don't worry about that. You're only blah blah years old. You're just a child. Well, okay, then guess what? Life lesson goes out the window. Y'all all know what I'm talking about. And frankly, look, you've been 18 before, you've been 19, you've been 20, you've been 22, you've been 23. We all can look back on our life and we all know that we're lying when we say that I didn't know what I was doing. Yes, you did. Right. Come on, can we be honest with ourselves? Come on, it's just me and you talking here, right? Can we be honest? Of course we can. So when we pretend like, oh, I didn't know what I was doing, I was just so young, we're lying. Right? We're simply trying to get out of something. Okay. This is the point. We're all talking here about unintentional sins. And so when we say, well, I did something and I made a mistake. Well, why do we make a mistake? We made a mistake because we were being negligent. Why were we being negligent? Because we weren't focused. That's where the intentionality comes in. Okay. So it says, continuing on here. All right. We're out of time here. So let me just kind of conclude with this final statement here. There's a lot of great insights here as to why we need a divine Messiah, but we'll have to table that for another time, another discussion. But anyway, it says here, in light of the above, we can better understand why the law obliges us to bring a sin offering for wrongs of this kind. We can also see that the degree of responsibility increases with the moral and spiritual level of the individual. When the sinner is a learned man, declares Rabbi Yehuda, an unintentional sin is equivalent to a sin committed knowingly. So this is, when our knowledge increases, so does our responsibility. This, of course, comes from the Talmud Bava Metzia, 33b. From that statement, we can understand why the Torah opens this chapter of Leviticus, chapter 4, with the case of the Kohen Gadol, followed by that of the great Sanhedrin, and finally the ruler of the people. So in other words, this whole thing about unintentionality and taking responsibility for it begins with the Kohen Gadol, who's supposed to be the holiest person of all. So in God's estimate, the point here is that in God's kingdom, we start with the highest level and work our way down. Okay. So again, if we're learned people, then the aim small, miss small becomes even more important, because those small things, those foxes that chew the vine, are actually giant wolves, and we have to deal with those. So I hope all of that makes sense. Listen, there's a whole lot more that I have to share here about this. And again, it gets into the discussion about intermediaries and why a man can't save us. and so on and so forth. But we're just simply out of time. We're never, however, out of content. Thank you for being with me today. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. I think, culturally speaking, it's an important topic. And I think that on a lot of different levels, if we will simply take all of what I've said today to heart, we'll be better people for it and be a better society for it. And we'll have a lot more maturity in our lives and culturally. So thank you again for being here. Remember to register for Passover. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And also, this is prep day. So have a great Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom to all of you. We'll be in the synagogue tomorrow. And Bezrat Hashem, tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to reignite the third meal study that we haven't done it since October because we had a bunch of classes that we were going through and so forth on Shabbat. But this coming Shabbat, with God's help, I'm going to reignite the third meal discussion. And my plan is for the next two Shabbats, for third meal, to dive into the depths of the study of Passover. Look at the secrets of Passover and get our hearts and minds prepared to enter into this most holy holiday. So hopefully you'll be able to join me for that. It'll probably occur. I was going to give you a time. I'm like, nope, don't let me do that because I don't want to be held to it. We'll figure that out. But it will happen on Shabbat afternoon. So God bless all of you. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you in Shul tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom.